All right, art historians, before we begin looking at the art of the Congo, I would like you to take a second and pause this screen and either send to me through Remind or through email or through Messenger an answer to each of these questions. All right, so one thing I want you to think about is send me the name of another artist that we have talked about who worked for royalty, just like Alaway of Isi did, the one who did the veranda post. So I want you to think of another artist that we've talked about who their main job was to work for royalty. Then the veranda posts that we talked about by Alaway of EC are a really good example of art being used to embellish or like decorate or add to architecture. So do me a favor and also send to me another work of art that was meant to be added to and enhance architecture. So like something that's on a building or something that's added to a building or decorated on a building to kind of give it extra meaning. All right, just like these veranda posts, like they weren't just put there to hold the porch up. They were there to have an entirely different symbolic meaning. So send me an answer to those two things, and the first person to do it will get a bonus point added to a previous test. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to move into the Congo. All right, so we have mostly been focusing over here on West Africa, where there's a great deal of conflict that's going to happen as places like Britain try to take over West Africa. Now, the Congo is not going to be any different. In fact, the Congo in the heart of Africa is going to be one of the places that really starts the scramble for Africa on the part of Belgium. And I shouldn't really even say Belgium because Belgium, the country, didn't do it. It was actually King Leopold of Belgium who went into, like, had his people go into the Congo. And basically, if you've ever heard of like the Hutu and the Tutsi, basically picked one of those sides and said, hey, we're going to arm you and let you basically enslave the other side. And you're going to make them work for us because we really want rubber. And the abuses that King Leopold, under his direction, that the people of Belgium did to the people of the Congo were just atrocious. In fact, there's a movie called King Leopold's Ghost. And in fact, his word of his abuses of the Congo people got to be so terrible that eventually Belgium, the government, actually took control of the colony in the Congo and said, all right, Leopold, you don't get to do this anymore. Like, this is no longer your own personal, thing. This is going to belong to Belgium, and we're going to make sure these human rights abuses don't actually, happen anymore. And the art of the Congo, a lot of it, in order to justify what they were doing, these European countries, they would look at the art of these people and use it as a way to say they're primitive, they are not advanced, and they are evil, and they need to be Christianized. They need us, or they deserve to basically be taken over. So they would use the art kind of as an excuse and say, like, look, these people are creating art like this, and it's so simple, they need us, all right? So one work of art that we're going to talk about is these Ndope figures, right, which are from the Kuba rulers. All right, so the Kuba from the Congo is a really good way to remember this. And I had you do for an activity to look at that these statues were not really meant to represent a particular individual. There are a couple things about these that make it unique. And there's a whole lot of theories about what these actually were for because they don't 100% know for sure. But a lot of them were taken away and taken back into art museums. This is a really good example of the type of art that a European country would hold up and go, look, I mean, they can't even create realistic looking art. Like, look at this. This is what they're creating. This is this savage, brutal type of people. So if you look at these, you'll notice that they're not individual characteristics, but there are conventions. Like there is a canon or rules that you needed to follow to create these particular statues because they didn't represent a king. They represented kingship and what it means to be a good king. So Kuba rulers would have these statues made of them. And there is so much contradictory evidence and so many theories on whether these were made before the king died or after the king died. And we'll get into some of those theories in a second. And the word Ndope actually means statue, all right? And it was, again, not to really identify them, like it wasn't supposed to have their characteristics. it was supposed to have characteristics of kingship. And there were really only two things that could identify which king this was. All right. So, for example, the facial characteristics may be just a little bit different. So, and by that, I mean just barely, right? In terms of maybe the face shape a little bit. And if you look down here on the bottom, they would have some kind of symbol that would, kind of be their own personal like crest, right? So something that represented them, but at the same time, it didn't really represent them. It represented something that they had done. So you would be able to identify that particular ruler by the little emblem that they had in front of them, that you would go, oh, well, I can't really tell by the face, but I can tell by that. And this is what I know that they did. So again, it's still reinforcing kingship and what you would do as a king. All right. So King Mishi is the one that they have done here. All right. So this is the Ndope statue of King Mishi to celebrate, they said, his generosity and his loyal subjects and what he gave to them. And you'll see that his personal symbol for King Mishi down here is a drum with a severed hand on it. Now, I don't know exactly what that says that he did for his people. Maybe it means he sacrificed of himself. He was very generous. He would give his own hand to people. He gave them a hand. Maybe he cut off the hands of his enemies. I don't know. All right. But apparently it has something to do with giving a hand in some way. This is the symbol that he chose for himself. So here are some of the theories about these. All right. So one, it would say that these statues could have been created during the life of the king, because it basically served as his proxy. Like if he wasn't around, this was the king. All right, so kind of like the Ka statues were for the Egyptians, but that was after death. So instead of those statues could hold the soul of the deceased pharaoh, these could potentially hold the soul of, let's say, a living king if he was nowhere nearby. Like it could be his proxy. They also said that it could be used that when the king was dying, his soul would leave his body and go into this statue. And then what would happen is the next king would sleep with this statue in his room, and then the spirit of the previous king would inhabit him and pass all those kingly virtues onto him, so that they have consistent rule and really good rulers. You'll notice that these are very stylized. They are deliberately not realistic, just like the veranda post, just like the Benin wall plaques, because they are trying to convey an idea, not necessarily a particular person. So, for example, you'll notice the head is a great deal bigger because these guys were supposed to be wise. All right, that was it. Like the bigger head, wiser person. Their eyes are always protruding out just a little bit because they could see almost into another world and communicate with spirits. Their eyes are downcast and closed, very calm and serene, like they're not warriors or fly off the handle people. They're very humble and calm. And so the Naim, okay, so the Nyim, that was the name of the king, was a Naim. That was the title for it. And artists specifically worked for the Naim. Like he controlled what was made, when was made. Controlling the art gives you a great deal of power. I just want to show you the difference. Okay, so we're talking on the left is a Baroque painting of Louis XIV, the Sun King of Paris and France. You can obviously tell that Louis wanted you to know this was him. It was celebrating him, not the idea of kingship, him. It looks like him. It has his hairstyle. It's showing off his calves. It's showing off his palace. It's showing off his money. It's about him. These Ndope statues were not about a particular person at all. They were about the idea of what a good king needed to be and what kingship actually meant. And only very, very little of this was unique to that particular king, right? Very, very little. So some other functions that you could see that have been put out there as far as what these were for is that it was built and created and sculpted, and you can see it's made of wood and very, very polished. All right, so smooth, because this is not somebody who's supposed to be rough, and it's supposed to show that it took a great deal of time to make it because it's got a very important patron. So that wood has been very well smoothed and luminous, almost like reflecting his spirit. And wives of the king or the Naim would take care of the statue, like almost like as if it was the king. He would get the same kind of treatment, the same kind of food, everything. And then through that, this king could ensure fertility. And that's what the wife would have, is fertility, because that's the most important thing. So then again, they would take these statues and it would be brought to his bedside to absorb the spirit of the king. And then the new king would absorb that spirit, so he would continue on with the consistency of very good rule. So this is the endope of King Mishi. All right, and you can see here I've zoomed in a little bit right there on the actual drum with the hand on it. So that's how we know it's actually him. Very, very stylized. And people from Europe looked at these and went, oh, look at this primitive Africa. Like they can't even get proportions right. It's like they're, but they didn't have to be as obvious as what Louis XIV was doing in Europe. Theirs was more of an idea than an individual, which I feel is just even more advanced personally. So again, if you guys look here, the head would always be larger because that's wisdom. The king would always have on his head the headdress that would identify that that is him. And he would have these arm bands and a shoulder embellishment over one arm. He would have the different layers of bands and bracelets around. He'd be sitting cross-legged in a lotus, kind of like meditative and calm, even though they're not Buddhist, but kind of the same idea. And I think that this is really interesting that they would always be shown in their left hand. And this is very important because your right hand is your stronger hand. Okay, that's usually your fighting hand, is your right hand. And there are left-handed people, but all of these were typically shown in their left hand, which is a weaker hand. And you'll notice that they're holding a sword and a knife, but they're holding it with the handle side out, right? And what this means is they're showing that they're not pointing it at you as a weapon. They're showing that it's here, I have it, but only if I need to use it will I. I mean, it's kind of like I have the power of authority, but I don't actually need to use it. And if you are watching this lecture and you send me another work of art that we talked about, where there is a weapon, but it's put away in a sign of peace, I will also add on a bonus point to a previous test for you. So you got to be quick and get that to me, all right? So again, all of these were not to be about a particular person. It's that idea of what a good ruler should be. So this is kind of similar to what we looked at. And for those of you who didn't have this first semester, this is from Korea, and this is the portrait of Sinuk Jew. And in Korea, they had adopted Confucianism, and they'd also adopted quite a few things from China. And there were these portraits of these Confucian elders to kind of honor them as being very, very wise. And they had a canon that they were supposed to follow of rules and how they were shown. So this is kind of similar to Korea. It's also similar to Egypt, that had a very strong canon of rules about how you show art. And also the Greeks, who, with the spear bearer, that was a really good example of a canon, a visual canon, if you will, of this is what art is supposed to look like. So the Kaba Kings still exist, right? They will rise again in power. And you can see here that they're kind of similar. Over here on the right, you can see that they have that huge headdress, right, which would be something we saw on the statues, that they're very embellished with the things over their shoulders and the bands on the arms. And it's also very, very heavy, if you notice. And he also has the knife in his hand, but he's actually got it pointed out. And it's in his right hand. So this may have been a different ceremony here. But he's wearing all of this really, really heavy stuff to show that, just like the other Kuba ruler, rule is heavy. And we saw this with in the Benin wall plaques, that with wearing the coral bands, that this was a heavy, heavy job, and they take it very, very seriously with the weight of their responsibility. So another tribe in the Congo was the Lucasa, the Luba. And the Luba are very, very wealthy. They had actually the largest tribe in the Congo during that time. And they also found the art to be very important. But just like we've seen with other art, it's never decorative in Africa. It's not meant to just be looked at. It's meant to be used. It's meant to be understood. And in this case, we're looking at a work of art that was meant to be performed and even read. So just like with other, parts of Africa we've looked at and other parts of the world, the rulers of this tribe were divine and they were sacred. But the only way you could be a good ruler is by knowing about your past. All right. So, this work of art, if you look at it, you'll notice that it has bigger beads and smaller beads. And then right there in the middle, it has a place for your knuckles to kind of like your fingers would come in through the back. And then you would almost like Braille run your fingers over the front of it and you would read this story, right? And you could, basically tell the story as you moved through it. And the idea was that their history was an oral history and individuals didn't really matter. It was the idea of the myths, the legends, the stories of these rulers about what made you a good ruler, what made you a bad ruler, and telling the story so that lessons could be learned from them. All right. History to them is not really chronological. There was Louis the 14th and Louis the 15th and Louis the 16th. No, it's more about finding the stories, telling the stories, because the story is more important than the timeline, right? It's more important of what did we learn from these times of rule. Doesn't matter when it happened, as long as we learn from it. It could have been the recent past, it could have been the far past, all right? And these are called Lucasa memory boards because they're about remembering. So larger beads could be more important events, smaller clusters of beads around larger beads could, be one type of event. And there's a special society called the Embodied, which is a council of men and women. Shocker, women could actually be trained to do this, who learn how to read and interpret these things, all right? So like colored beads could be a specific person or story. A line of beads could be like a lineage. But again, you're kind of interpreting as you read and kind of remembering as you go through it. It's almost like just something to spark your memory because the chronology is not as big a deal as making sure you tell the stories that people need to learn from. So you can see here that this is how Lucasa memory boards would look. And they're meant to be, they're not always big, but you can see here that this guy is reading it and he's going through the story and he's following along with the beads, and those spark his memory of things he needs to tell. And these are all Lucasa memory boards, but you can see that they look different because it's just whatever sparks your memory to tell the story. So this is the Embodied Society, and it's very, very, and you notice there's a woman right there in the middle, and I should have put men and women who knew how to read it. But this was something that even females, because in Africa, they were one of the last few matrilineal cultures where they valued the female line more than the male line. So women could have this opportunity to learn how to read these. Now, people from Europe brought these back and said, look at this art. Like, look at this. This is how primitive these people are. They've got sticks and bumps and all these things on this wooden board. These are the people who they thought this on the left was advanced. Like that type of storytelling where Europe needed pictures. These people didn't. They had an oral history. They didn't need to have pictures because the idea was more important than remembering the specific events. All right, this one's one of my favorite ones to teach. I love teaching this. And I feel like right now, I need to make one of these because I've been stuck in my house with my family for a really long time. And we could maybe use one of these power figures. But I want you to imagine for a second, if you were a European and you came into the Congo and you saw a tribe that had works of art that looked like this. So you have what looks to be a human, and it's got all different kinds of metals shoved into it, like basically wooden nails, metal nails, spikes, all of these things. You'd probably think these people are into something like voodoo and it's evil and they're trying to kill people and trying to, murder them. Nope, that is actually 100% not what this was about. All right. So this is a power figure from the Congo. And I'm going to let you guys watch this for a second because there's so many good details in it. And then we'll talk about this a bit further.
We're at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we're looking at a Congo Nkisi figure from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So the Congo is in Central Africa. It was a large kingdom that was founded in the 14th century and over the centuries eventually colonized by Belgium. When the Portuguese, who arrived in Africa in the late 15th century, saw these figures, Nkisi, and also brought missionaries to Christianize the people of the Congo, they asked that these figures be burned.
The term Nkisi refers to a spirit, but more specifically medicine. And when I say medicine, I don't mean an aspirin. I mean the herbs and supplements that a healer would use to help someone on a physical, but also on a spiritual, mental, and emotional level. The Inganga is the ritual specialist among the Congo in this period of time, around the 19th century, who would use Nkisi figures to help his clients.
So the Inganga would ask a sculptor to carve this, and then the Inganga would use it over the course of a considerable amount of time, and over that time this figure would accrue everything that we see on it. And all of this material is covering its abdomen, where likely, although we can't see it, is a case for holding that spiritual medicine.
That spiritual center, the moyo, the belly, is where you place the medicine or the materials, and it could be stone, it could be herbs, it could be pastes and clays. The Inganga would be mixing this formula together, placing it in the cavity in the belly, and then covering up so that it's completely sealed.
So the Inganga would use this figure in several different ways. He could use it to heal a client who came to him, but he could also use it to record agreements and contracts, and also could activate it to go after evildoers.
As a witness, the Nkisi really is there to honor contracts and agreements and oaths that are taken, and the Inganga might take a strip of cloth and literally tie and bind that agreement together.
So each one of those knots that we're seeing is likely that.
And in order for the Nkisi to do your bidding, that is to go after someone who broke an oath or did you wrong, you might use dog's teeth or elements of birds.
And we see a sharp object that looks like it belonged to an animal, a bird or a dog, that could do harm.
In order to activate this Nkisi, because really it's just a piece of wood until it's activated with a spirit, the Inganga would hammer nails into its skin, thereby calling attention to the Nkisi to come and do its bidding.
So there are so many nails. It feels like this was used over decades.
It constantly looks different as the Inganga works. And while we see it here encrusted and crumbling and full of lots of materials, what it's probably missing is the medicine that was in its abdomen originally. Because it's said that the medicine pouch is so central and so potent, you would not sell this piece or let it fall into the hands of anyone but the Inganga with that present.
So likely it originally had legs, was able to stand, had a base. Those are not here. It's impossible to know exactly what those looked like. But the figure really is encrusted on all of its sides. But there's another example here at the mat where we can see more clearly the opening in the abdomen.
And we notice that that abdomen is hollow. So whatever was inside of it has been taken out, rendering it impotent.
We also see amulets. One of them is beaded. Another looks almost like a nut that's got some carving on the outside.
Seed pods, pieces of animal, carved figures, and the carved figures actually have something inside of their bellies.
And we seem to have two interlocking crocodiles.
We also have a bell on the side, which is similar to the nails in that it can be rung to bring the Nkisi spirit into this figure. And the Nkisi would have been housed in the Inganga's home, in his shrine.
If I was a client, I would bring money or something to trade to the Inganga, who would do this work for me, either mark a contract or an agreement of some kind or right some sort of wrong for me.
And so the Inganga also has to remember what each one of these nails and knots were for. The Nkisi then becomes a wonderful historic social document of a group of people who sought out help from their ritual specialist.
Okay, so I really love teaching this piece, right? I just think it's so powerful and so cool what they came up with as a way for them to handle agreements or conflict resolutions. So she talks about the Inganga, who's like a spiritual healer, and not just a physical healer of the body, but also like a healer of conflict. So the Inganga would be kind of a mediator, kind of a lawyer slash doctor slash medicine man slash priest who would allow people to come in and create agreements, or if somebody needed protection, or they needed to hammer out, literally hammer, like the nails, hammer out some kind of conflict. And the bigger the problem, the quicker you needed to call this Inkisi to release its power. So what you have here is you see that some of these nails are kind of small, and it's like, hey, we could use your help, or hey, this is a really big issue. We need you to get here right now. So you would see these in very alert positions. You can see this one's kind of like an aggressive kind of monkey or ape, right? That's kind of like in an aggressive stance with his knuckles forward with eyes open because, they can kind of see into this other world. And a king would often ask for one of these to be made, and then it would be given to the Inganga, who that would be his job, is to kind of mediate some of these conflicts. So you have that central area where you could put in medicine to heal, which could also heal medical problems, but it could heal conflict as well. They could also put in ashes if they're like, hey, we need this particular ancestor to step in right now and mediate this, right? So when they would need to activate that and get the Inkisi to come on, the key to do that was by hammering something into the particular Inkisi or the statue. And so you would be like, okay, we need you to come here like now. This is a little issue or this is a really big issue, and we need you to come in and step in. So they would need it to mediate conflict between people within the tribe, or even with enemies at the same time. But this had so many powers to heal, and not just physical or illness, but also like community conflict. All right. So these are a couple other examples of it. And by the way, the St. Louis Art Museum has one of these, and it's really, really cool. So unfortunately, Europeans will use these power figures as a way to justify that what they were doing and conquering the people of the Congo was good, because they were like, these are evil people who are trying to kill us, and they're going to rebel against us, kind of like African Native American dances that they would do to kind of rebel against and kind of drive up the energy against these people. So a lot of these were destroyed as witchcraft or sorcery or voodoo dolls, and kind of used as justification to say, hey, we're wiping out these people who are really, really terrible. But mostly it was to remove their power. You remove the art, and then you feel like you remove the soul of the people. All right, so we're going to stop there. And the next things that we're going to look at are works of art that were meant to empower people of Africa. So not necessarily ones that were used by Europeans to kind of, knock them down and say they were primitive, but we're going to look at works of art that celebrated and were a very critical part of African culture, especially in performances.